During the communist times in Central Europe, housing projects were dominated by the modernist concrete panel blocks of flats. The Western world abandoned that approach roughly in the 70s, but the Eastern Bloc continued and new panel housing was still built even in the early 1990s. That quickly started to change with the post-communist political changes as societies demanded a switch. But switch where? What to build now in the new era? What sort of style and look? And what kind of flats for who? Those were the questions architects faced, so let's see how they answered in the new world. In this video, let's only focus on architecture of the 90s housing project. I really must stress once again that architecture and urbanism, of course, go hand in hand, in some styles more than in others, but I'm still going to draw a line between the two today, because at the same time, this is a YouTube video and it should have some reasonable length. And I would really like to focus on urbanism separately to just get the point across better. But anyways, let's start. The background before the 90s was quite simple. Housing was practically only panel blocks of flats, problems with too much standardization and uniformity were known, and of course political and economic problems were known, and all of this was kept under a lid with pressure building up. The pressure released in 1989 and suddenly people demanded something different. But in some areas they perhaps got a bit too much difference. So new housing projects actually had pretty clear number one requirement. Do whatever you want, just for all that is holy, please do not make it look like the old communist panel housing. That's it. So in more extreme cases that meant totally ditch uniformity, apply much more varied and playful color palette, heavily customize each project, make it more individual, or provide more variety of flat types compared to the panel housing. And then it depended on each architect and the private investor how they would approach this. So, of course, money played a big role. Anyways, enough of this. I think it's going to be crystal clear how things were done when I show you a couple of real-life examples. Let's start in Prague, since there are so many 90s and very early 2000s housing projects that are vastly different from each other. There are so many because they are also quite small, so it works with the fact that there were not that many flats finished in the 90s, but they were just finished in many smaller projects, smaller compared to the panel districts, of course. Also, one more thing that I want to mention in here, and that's kind of the reason why I'm focusing on Prague. For the past year or so, I was searching for a flat to buy in Prague, and without exaggeration, I saw hundreds of detailed adverts, and I have been inside at least 20 or so flats. So I now have a completely different view of a lot of these projects, mostly looking at them not from the perspective of a random pedestrian, but rather a very strongly potential owner. And it really surprised me how significantly it changed my perception of a lot of places in Prague or general districts, including the panel housing, for better or worse. So I will somewhat try to convey that experience a little from now on. This is the Hviezda or Star project in Prague from late 90s. This place illustrates so many changes in housing approach, so let's break it down. This district is an old late 1950s panel housing area, actually one of the first ones in Prague. It was never completed and it left a big space open right here. The name of this project and some basic inspiration for the shapes of those corner towers actually comes from a nearby Star summer palace from the 16th century. So there is that postmodern historical quote, among others. It is, and it was back in the day, a relatively good address in Prague, so quite expensive. The Hviezda project was then right from the start planned as expensive housing, perhaps even the most expensive housing, high-density housing project in Prague of the late 90s. So the architect had practically no limits, money was not a problem. The architect made it very clear that he heavily disliked panel housing, including its urbanism and some other principles, and wanted to completely turn its back to it, literally. He specifically wanted to provide huge contrast to the panel housing, to provide something totally new, to escape those previous decades of panel uniformity. And uniformity it certainly did escape. Everything is customized, especially the roofs are crazy detailed. The project used expensive materials, since it could, which is partially the reason why, after some 25 years, the place looks as good as new. The second reason is that it's really well maintained, including the public spaces, which are private property, although freely accessible, which is really nice. Maintenance is clearly a chore, with all of these deconstructed or somewhat historical details. If this was built with cheaper materials, I don't believe people would bother after a while. But you know, it's almost as if it's easier to maintain something when you like it, when it's worth it. It was certainly not affordable housing when it was built. It was intended to exactly fill the gap for higher standard of flats compared to the panel housing, once again. These days, there are somewhat normal, quotation marks, flats towards the bottom, sold for ordinary Prague prices these days. But the top floors have huge multi-floor apartments, including the observation towers and all the crazy stuff that's happening on the roofs. Those flats go for around €1,000,000 even, perhaps even more these days. It's crazy. Still, even architects and critics who have problems with the looks do agree it is a good place to live in. I like this one. It kind of feels cozy between the buildings when you are just walking, especially inside of these blocks. It's obviously very over the top, but kind of differently, not typically 90s over the top for Czechia or Poland. It actually somewhat reminds me of some of those 90s works in Hungary we have seen before, the more fantasy looking ones. But at the same time, it's one of a kind, small neighborhood, not a huge mega district where it would be a little overwhelming. We will surely return to this place once more some other time because we need to focus on urbanism of this area, which is kind of the main reason the place works, but not now. Now we move on. The second place is the Green Valley residential project. It was built practically at the same time, but it uses totally different approach. The main motivation for the layout is very obvious: to build something using principles of old city blocks from around the first third of the 20th century. The project is then clearly not as expensive as the previous one, but somewhat more normal. The architecture, especially if we look below the roofs, is practically one-to-one copy of those old styles of old city blocks. So the relatively flat facades, the style of loggias, balconies, those extrusions starting at the second floor extending over the street, very typical. Those recessed top floors with terraces, simple entrances, and many, many more. It is very postmodern though, so at the same time, it is absolutely obvious that it is a new project, despite the historical quotes. Materials are clearly new, especially the metal parts, windows, doors, and color palette, of course. That's probably the number one thing we are going to notice that is very 90s. Unlike in the previous project, here the cheapest option of simpler plaster facades were used, which kinda does give it a little plastic look, certainly combined with the bright colors. Various buildings then have all sorts of elements, some pointing towards some old functionalism, and then there are the very new deconstructivist parts, especially up on the roofs. Roofs are mostly rounded, tube style, with some short gables here and there. The inner blocks are probably private, I'm not sure, but once again they are open to the public, and they are very green, with playgrounds and nice pedestrian paths, so that's just benefiting the project so much. Again, urbanism of this place is what matters, but apart from those things that I mentioned, it's not exactly very good. Nearby is the gigantic South City panel housing project, specifically the later South City 2. After 1989, it was not finished yet, with plans to complete it with the Flora estate, already with more or less postmodern urbanism. But panel housing was not wanted anymore, so what to do? Well, in the first stages, let's build customized panel blocks of flats. Customized so they are not even going to look like panel blocks of flats. Here they are. Yes, this is actually a panel house, and it is the same standardized system as this from just a couple of years earlier. Again, it's not a recent refurbishment. This is how the building was built anew in the early 90s. Crazy difference, isn't it? This is a very rare example of what could have been done with the panel systems going forward, although it is more than likely inside it faced similar technical problems. As I explained before, the panel industry required huge housing projects to survive, so these couple of buildings here and there did not make the production economical with how the manufacturing was set up. Still, in the early 90s, the transition away from prefabrication did not happen yet, so we find these incredibly rare examples. Interesting little detail is in here. This flat in the middle did not change their old windows, so we can spot the very typical 90s window style with more of those horizontal lines, somewhat mimicking those old wooden windows. So once again, that postmodern try to return back. The rest of the estate has a mix of all kinds of other postmodern 90s buildings. Once again, with the typical elements as elsewhere, so mainly the generous roof, where there must be some luxury flats by the looks of it, then all sorts of metal decorations, railings, pillars, old-style window shapes, some hints of functionalism here and there with the rounded shapes, and actually there is a lot of symmetry, which is unusual for postmodernism. In this project, I was considering to buy a flat in this building, I believe, with one of the balconies somewhere in the middle. One flat has one half of that rounded balcony, which is super common with all sorts of projects in this time period. Inside, it was looking rather good. It was very spacious and kind of comfortable, but overall the estate does not feel as cozy or welcoming. Maybe you can even see that from these pictures. The streets are lacking greenery a little. There is a noisy avenue right next to it, and it just lacks some sort of coherent plan, I guess. Maintenance of the streets here is not great either, except next to those panel houses, actually. Those are looking really nicely maintained. But overall urbanism here is kind of lacking, but maybe I'm going to return to it later, like I said with those previous projects. Anyways, moving on. Another example is the continuation of the Black Bridge estate on the edges of Prague. It is once again very much different approach. In the previous examples, uniformity was avoided like the plague. Over here, it was kind of accepted with some postmodern details, which is perhaps pointing towards this project not being exactly expensive. These are buildings from the eastern part. Not much to say about them, really. Orange box, although with some details breaking away, hinting different roofs, but that's about it. Height variations are minimal and practically no decorations. From the inner blocks, it looks exactly the same, so even balconies or loggias are not done all that much as elsewhere. The western part of the district has different buildings, much more postmodern. It basically has two square blocks, one completely gray, the other completely pink, but both nearly identical. The postmodern elements here are very obvious. The roof spikes, most likely without rooms inside because there are no windows, maybe on the roof itself. There are rounded balconies, occasional round window, and just the style of staircases and the big windows on them. To be completely honest, I do not like this place too much. It certainly does not feel as cozy as the other projects. Although, once again, pictures do not tell the whole story, and I'm sure people living in here do call this place home easily. Still, the place massively suffers from lack of greenery. This picture is from the main street, where greenery is alright. Even the grey building is looking much better from this view because it's kinda hidden. But then there are these side streets, and they do not have a single tree somewhere. Only parked cars, and it's just looking horrible. If the buildings were a little hidden behind trees, you would certainly have different feel from them, but here they are completely in the open, which these buildings just cannot afford, in my opinion. They are just not good enough for that. What's also pretty bad are inner blocks. This gate here is only for cars, but the blocks are open for pedestrians. I'm just showing you this to notice its design, but also that it has seen better days, like the rest of the district, really. Despite underground parking below here, there is also surface parking everywhere, except for a tiny sports ground in the middle with a few sad trees, looking like they are not even here originally. Even the bottom floors of buildings have parking spaces, which, in my opinion, just illustrates how the developer cheaped out on the underground garages, among many other things, it seems. The first block I showed you then also has paved inner block on top of a garage, this time without parking spaces on top, which just raises even more questions, like why wasn't it changed already? I guess the answer might be quite simple at the end of the day, because people might just not care. The place was not designed very well to create that motivation for people to maintain it well or demand its maintenance or improvement. This is crystal clear from the building's facades. It's practically the same age as buildings shown before, but it's in much worse state. And unfortunately, the closer you look, the worse it gets, with all sorts of shoddy details. Oh well, it's still an example of late 90s projects, just from a different side of the spectrum, really. But in other urbanistic areas, it's actually really good. So once again, we will take a look at that later. Okay, so that was Prague. There are so many more projects in there, but time is short. Similar housing architecture can be found in other neighboring countries as well. East Germany I'm not going to show, since I did not find good examples to only talk about architecture. What I showed you in the previous video still applies, and it's kind of enough. East Germany did not go this way of over-the-top postmodernism, but rather already went for the minimalistic white box style of housing, typical for 2010s or 2020s further east. In Hungary, I did not find many 90s projects, but Hungary is overall very difficult to research from the outside. I did find quite a lot of early to mid 2000s, but it's probably best to keep those for later. Also, Hungarians built a lot of low-density housing, so that's not exactly what we are focusing on in here. Still, there is one place, but before that, since I showed you those postmodern concrete panel blocks of flats, let's catch up with that in Hungary, where such experiments were done in the late 1980s already. This is probably the most famous and largest one, from Debrecen. These are actually panel houses built like this originally. The roofs are quite obviously a major difference from the nearby panel housing, but also notice the organic shapes of these blocks, clearly requiring some heavy customization. Surprisingly, many details are very similar to that 90s panel house from Prague that I showed you earlier. And this is now an example of that 90s housing, this time from Győr in Hungary. This part of the older panel housing estate was continued in the 90s, and this is just a beautiful shot. Look at that. We have the old panel house here on the right, and exactly the same system, the same building really, just built anew in the 90s to look more postmodern, to not look like a panel house any longer. So that's just a perfect comparison, side by side like this. Then later in the 90s, these couple of blocks were continued. Again, Hungarians did not really go for crazy designs like Czechia or Poland, so here it's basically just the roofs that are doing the style. But then again, there are these kinds of details like the towers and all sorts of extrusions from the facades and things like that. By the way, this school is also built in the 90s, and it's actually super similar to the style of the university campus, of the 90s university campus in Budapest, right? So it's got that brick facade, the dark roofs, and the green details elsewhere. So that's actually looking really good. Let's just make a quick stop in Szczecin, Poland, in the Bukowe estate. Once again, older, but not much older, panel housing estate from mid-1980s that was continued in the 90s. First, these two lines of buildings were built in mid-90s, and soon followed by these green roofs and these smaller inner block houses. And then later in the 2000s, many more buildings, actually making the district in the end something like half and half between panels and the rest, which is quite unusual. These are actually not all that massively different from the panel housing, looking at the window and balcony positions, although the gable roofs make all the difference in the overall look, as you can see. Uniformity is also broken by the offsets of buildings and a little bit by colors, but nothing crazy. I had to investigate a little further because I had a suspicion that these might actually be customized panel houses from the looks of them, but according to the real estate adverts and pictures from the inside, they are not. It's likely concrete frames and bricks. These younger houses are similar, just the colors are different, but otherwise they are not some crazy 90s style postmodernism, even though the postmodern elements are clear, with the tube staircases and again the roofs. Here the architects clearly wanted to do something different with the surfaces, so they used these light red or almost pink bricks on roads and pavement. Overall, the place looks like a very well-kept garden. There are so many flowers, different trees, those short decorative wooden fences. It feels very warm and cozy in here, well, at least from street view. It's something the older panel part misses. Anyways, it's time to wrap this up. I have many more places to show you, but we will leave them to talk about urbanism in some other video. I wanted to make a single episode about it together, but it would have been way too long. Urbanism is arguably the most important part of the entire postmodern talk. Some architects, when they wrote of postmodernism, wrote critique of modernism, sometimes practically only talked about urbanism, about necessary changes and switches. But still, I wanted to start with the architecture to not just leave it without the context first. It's then going to be easier to talk about urbanism when we already know about the buildings, before we talk about the building's role in the city. Postmodernism is of course mainly associated with the architecture, with the crazier examples unfortunately, but what cities felt the most is that switch in urbanism, which went hand in hand with a lot of architectural principles, as we will see. I already talked about it though a little bit in that 80s episode with the start of postmodernism, but let's just leave a proper introduction to some other time. I just already wanted to hint that it's going to be huge. But anyways, the places I showed you somewhat illustrated that it's not easy to briefly recap the entire housing situation, unlike with the panel housing before. The projects now were all over the place, going for crazier or more grounded designs on the other hand, but the goals, at least theoretically, were similar. Provide alternative to the panel housing, while customizing the projects so much more. Remember that really fitting phrase from last time, mass customization. That definitely applies to housing. So in front of us, there are still many topics related to housing. So urbanism, low density housing, family houses basically, living conditions, some related economy and policies regarding financing and ownership, plus many other topics unrelated to housing in the 90s. In the next episode, we will take a little break from all of this. I think it's needed, and we will focus on big roads, highways. Okay, and now briefly, let's talk about the projects that I built here in Altengrad for this video. Well, actually, I built 3 projects. I'm only showing you 2 because, like I mentioned throughout the video, I think this video got way too long when I first thought it's gonna be housing and urbanism together. It makes sense to talk about it together, but then again, it just got way too long. So this video is already a little too long, but yeah, I had to just cut out the urbanism part from it, which means I would really like to keep something to show you, in that urbanism video, to actually build something there. I'm probably going to build more there, but I'm just going to show you the 3rd place that I built originally for this episode, all right? That basically just means that in this video, I built 2 projects that I'm showing you right here. All right, so the first project, by the way, I had to improvise with the available assets from the workshop, because I think I already mentioned that in the previous postmodernism video that the workshop, it really does not have these sorts of buildings. It actually does have quite a lot of postmodern buildings, but mostly from the United States and mostly big ones, skyscrapers. So not something I can use over here. So I just browsed whatever I had, browsed the workshop and all, and I finally found a few buildings that were fitting. So, for example, with this first project, I actually managed to find a true 1990s buildings from Switzerland. But, you know, they can easily be used over here as well. I think the style perfectly matches this location. So here I basically just use these to create some kind of a semi-closed block and then just a little line, and create some sort of underground garages with private fenced-off parks on top of that. Then there is like a multi-function block housing offices, shops here in this corner. Again, that was just some kind of housing pack or commercial pack that I downloaded from the workshop that vaguely resembles the 90s over here in Central Europe. So I just used it here. And then, of course, I put all of these roofs around to just make it like more 90s, you know? There is also that pyramid glass sculpture there at the front entrance to this block. So yeah, that's just typical 90s. The road system in here is kind of clunky, but that's because I'm preparing for some projects in the future. All right. Now, this second place, again, I just got some kind of pack of buildings, the residential tower, some commercial lower buildings, probably from the United States, I believe, but they kind of sort of fit the style that I was going for, so I just used it. Yeah, the residential tower is not quite the 90s. There was a residential tower built in Poland in the 90s, finished in 2000 or 2000, early 2000s, maybe something like that. But residential towers are then very common for 2000s, 2010s. But hey, I just had it in the pack. It was perfectly matching. I mean, it was exactly matching these buildings down below. So, you know, I just used it. Don't look too much into it. But anyways, this second place, I kind of took some inspiration, urbanistically, I guess, from the Hviezda project, Star project from Prague. That's with the layout of the buildings, not following the established one with the prefabs. And it's like visibly different from the prefabs. Yeah, that's what I wanted to illustrate with this particular cinematic right here. That is just something completely different, and the tower just sticking out there. This is also the comparison between the old and new of that first place. So yeah, the difference is there. It's quite noticeable, even though these two projects are actually only like a decade apart. So that's interesting. Thank you so much for watching this one. If you liked it, then please, you know the drill below the video. And huge thanks to channel members who are directly supporting this channel and me in what I'm doing. I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. Take care. Goodbye.